So this video is based on something that several people on YouTube seem to be doing, and I thought to myself, why not do it too? It's always fun to speculate and come up with new ideas, and I figure that if enough people do it, maybe some of it could actually, hypothetically, end up happening, so it's all cool. What I've chosen to do is split my ideas into 4 parts. There's leveling, endgame, garrisons, and extra things. I'm mainly focusing on the endgame content, as that's where I mostly feel like the game falls short outside of simply raiding. So let's go. One of the things I really enjoyed about leveling in the current expansion was the bonus objectives. It was different from anything we've ever seen in WoW before, and it's something that I think could be improved upon. The way I'd like to see this done would be by adding bonus objectives to literally every zone in the game. On top of this, I'd like to see them in enough of a number that one could literally go from level 1 to level 100 without ever doing anything but bonus objectives. That way, it would be possible for players to have another choice as to how they'd like to level, which I personally think would be great. Personally, I am sick and tired of questing as well as just spamming dungeons from level 15 and onwards, which I've done so many times. It's just, it's painful now, guys. I don't like to put on rose-tinted glasses, but a thing that I actually missed from years back was the difficult elite mobs. You know, those that were so scary that you would actually run from them if you saw them, unless you had a group. I'd like to see some of those return, however, in an even stronger state. We're talking elites with actual mechanics that you would have to pay attention to or you would die. There would be super hard ones where you receive a notification in general chat or, whatever, when it spawned, and then it could reward a slightly higher item level green or blue item for anyone who helped kill it. It would give more of an incentive to group up in open world, which is something I quite miss. Seeing players around the open world areas was just, it felt good, it felt alive. One of the things I really disliked right from the get-go was the fact that the Apexis gear was so expensive and that the crafted gear took up so many materials to get and then upgrade afterwards as well. I do feel like they should be obtainable pretty quickly, and what I'd like to see is cheaper Apexis gear as well as having the crafted gear pieces require far less materials. I say this because I feel like both things should function purely as catch-up mechanics, and thus they're in a category of gear that should just be fairly simple, but more importantly, quite fast to actually just get a hold of. To further expand upon bonus objectives as well, I like to see level 100 ones as well in zones assigned for max levels, so in WoD, for example, it would be Tanane Jungle. These bonus objectives would then reward various things such as, Apexis crystals, crafting materials, and maybe even world BOEs. Although, for them to be fully relevant nowadays, we would need higher item level ones. Speaking of Apexis crystals, which is a currency that I think could easily work fine with some adjustments, I'd love to have heroic dungeons reward more than just a tiny bit of gold. In fact, I'd like them to reward Apexis crystals' reputation with the chosen faction, as well as those savage satchels that tanks and healers can get. This should, however, also be rewarded when queuing with premates. Truth be told, I'm actually furious that for me to get satchels that I use to get augment runes and gear for my ults, I have to queue alone. Do not fucking give me more reason to play with myself, get it, than to play with friends. Like, whose idea was that, and why is it still going on? Yet another Apexis Crystal related thing I'd like to see would be this. A daily event in a random zone anywhere in the game. That could be in Azeroth, Outland, or Draenor, and this would basically be a world boss-ish kind of NPC that players would get together and kill. The reward would be even more Apexis crystals, or maybe toys, cosmetics, or something else entirely that I can't exactly think of. It would give players a reason to go back to the older zones instead of them being completely dead all the time. I mean, imagine being a completely new player walking around in Darkshore, which is a zone really empty, it's without players. But then suddenly a group of like 20 or 30 max level players come running past you. That sounds pretty sweet to me. Returning to the topic of the heroic dungeons, I'd like to address the following things. I feel that heroic dungeons should be dropping better gear than LFR. And I'm not one of the people who have a genuine problem with LFR being in the game, but heroic dungeons are gated by silver proving grounds, which I think is fine, but they also are harder than LFR. Plus, LFR should absolutely not be part of the gearing process for people looking to raid. On top of this, I'd love to see more dungeons with every content patch, and the new dungeons would then drop better gear than the previous dungeons to function as part of the new catch-up mechanic, and at the same time they could release the mythic difficulty for the already existing heroics, which would then drop the same item level as the new heroic dungeons. This would continue to give people a reason to run the dungeons, and it would also be cool new content. 5-man dungeons is some of my favorite content, at least. I'd also like to see a new currency introduced to the game. It could function either like the old school badges from Wrath, or like Valor Points, which was taken away from us with the release of WoD. The idea would then be that this currency would be rewarded for killing raid bosses while in a guild group. Said currency could then be used to purchase gear that was on par with normal heroic raid gear, and the gear would have to cost quite a few points in order to prevent someone from getting fully raid geared, despite actually only having killed the first 1 or 2 bosses in the raid. Forcing it to be done in the guild group would give people another incentive to make friends online, which I think is just an overall cool idea. An alternative way of doing this would be for the kills to reward the guild itself with points. These points could then be used as a guild to reward a specific player some gear. For it to work properly though, you would need to have participated in a certain number of boss kills with said guild to actually be eligible for the gear, you know? Lastly, while we're on the topic of endgame content, I'd like to change the way the legendary works. I'm not a fan of legendaries just dropping from a boss like the Warglaves did, nor am I a fan of legendaries only being available to a certain set of classes like Shadowmourne was. That said, I'm not a fan of the way it works now either. I'm okay with it being a legendary ring, though I do find the effect of the legendary ring to be fucking horrific, but the problem is the fact that it's not a hard thing to obtain. It's incredibly time consuming, but also really, really easy. And I hate it when things are time consuming just for the sake of being time consuming. I don't mind it taking almost the entire expansion to get the thing, but at least let it be time consuming because it's actually difficult. I like to think that I covered my thoughts on the garrisons pretty well in my previous video, but to summarize, here are the things I'd like changed. I believe they need to be more about fun and customization of your own personal base, and less about whatever is more beneficial to you as a raider or as a PvPer. I'd like to see buildings like the salvage yard and the bunker removed entirely, as well as maybe even the profession buildings. This would give people more of a reason to go to the main cities and meet people. I'd like to draw the line at the barn, but on the following condition. In patch 6.0 and 6.1, the only way to get Savage Blood, which was a required material for upgrading your crafting gear, was through the barn. In patch 6.2, however, we'll be using Fellblight, which can't be obtained through the barn. Instead, it'll be obtained through gathering. My condition for the barn is that whatever the material is, it would be obtainable through the barn and through gathering professions. That way, people could choose to stay away from gathering professions and not actually rely on them, or they could choose to rely on them for the sake of having another customization-based building rather than the barn. This would give people a realistic choice for buildings. Another thing I feel would be really cool about the garrisons would be if you were actually giving the option to transmog the gear of your followers, essentially making them look, the way you want them to. I for one would love that, but I imagine there are heavy role players out there who would really love that idea, so that they could essentially create a theme in their garrison that fit their story. These last points I will be going through very quickly, as there's not a lot to be said here. First of all, I'd like to see the bonus objectives being repeatable, essentially turning them into more or less the same type of events as those in Guild Wars 2. That'll give players a reason to stay online for more than an hour a day at most. Second, I'd like to see every expansion having neutral main cities. I didn't play in BC, but I do feel that Dalaran functioned way better than the Shrines of Mob or the faction cities of WoD. It's just cooler to have a neutral city. Third, I'd like to see Blizzard introduce training grounds in the game. The idea I had in mind was that it would be an optional thing tied to proving grounds. On the training grounds, however, you would be taught how to use your spells and when different ones are truly useful. I feel that it would help people get through silver proving grounds, as well as just create an overall more skilled player base. I really don't feel like leveling teaches players enough about their classes and specs. Next, since flying doesn't seem to be coming back, which I have zero problems with, it really just feels appropriate to let players transmog their taxis or whatever so that they would actually have a unique use for their flying mounts. I get that we can still use our flying mounts on the ground, but running around on a huge winged dragon really just doesn't look that cool. On top of that, they could make flying mounts really cool by having them fly around above you in your garrison. Make them seem special even though we can't actually fly them. Do something. Lastly, I'd absolutely love to see the return of profession perks. I addressed this almost a year ago when we first heard about them going away, but ultimately I feel that I no longer have a reason to really care about professions, all of which I think are incredibly boring personally, whereas before the removal of perks, I felt like I had a good reason to choose one over the other. I do feel like the perks should be slightly different though, so that, it won't become a matter of all DPSers always having engineering and so on. They would have to design the perks in a way that lets all profession being used across different classes and specs. Anyway, guys, that's it for the rant, and this is obviously just some of the ideas I have, and I'd love to know your opinions as well. If you liked the video, make sure to comment and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.